This video is sponsored by Netlify, which is a fantastic service that I use all the time to deploy websites and apps in literally seconds. They offer a ton of features, even with the free plan, including continuous deployment, HTTPS, and add-ons like contact form submission and serverless functions. You can host regular websites, front-end apps using technologies like React, Gatsby, Vue.js, and more. So if you're looking for a simple and modern way to deploy your website, check out netlify.com or click the link in the description below. Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to my Angular crash course. If this is the first crash course that you've watched, I do have one for React and Vue as well, where we build the same simple application, going over the concepts, syntax, and structure of each framework. Therefore, you can compare and contrast and see which one fits you best. So we're going to go through some slides, and then we'll jump in and we'll start writing some code with Angular. So what is Angular exactly? It's a full-featured JavaScript framework built and maintained by Google, and it's used for building front-end web applications or building the front end of a full-stack app where maybe you have something like Node or Python or PHP running on the back end. Now, as far as popularity, I think React is in first place in terms of the number of jobs and stuff like that. But Angular is still very relevant. It's still thriving, especially in the world of big business and enterprise. I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. And even though it may not be the most popular, it's still one of the big three, which are React, Vue, and Angular. Now, I want to make a quick note on the versions of Angular because this is something that has confused some people for a long time. Back in, I think, 2010, AngularJS was released, which is still available today, but it's a completely different framework in all aspects. When they created Angular version 2, they decided to do a complete rewrite of the framework. Okay, we're now on version 7. However, version 2 through 7 are the same framework. There's just been some minor updates, as with any framework, most of which are under the hood updates that have made the framework better, smaller, and faster. All right, so let's take a look at some reasons to use Angular. So as with any framework, it gives you an organized front-end structure. So all your user interface parts are basically components, reusable components. We also have modules and services, which we'll be getting into a little later. Angular is extremely powerful and full-featured, and this is great if you're building something really big and intricate. However, it could be overkill for many small applications. It is an all-in-one solution, meaning it has a router, it has its own HTTP module, it uses the RxJS library, which is reactive extensions. It includes things like observables for asynchronous data, so it's just packed with different features and different concepts. Angular is used to build very powerful single-page applications. It uses an MVC type pattern, which stands for Model View Controller, which essentially was a back-end pattern, but with Angular we can structure our front-end applications in a similar way. It also uses TypeScript, which is a superset of JavaScript, meaning it includes everything JavaScript does plus more, including static typing and many ES6-like features such as classes, arrow functions, and so on. So like many frameworks, Angular has a CLI or a command line interface. However, the Angular CLI is very powerful in that you can generate components, services, and other things on the fly rather than creating them manually, which is really cool. So we're going to get into all of this stuff. All right, so what should you learn before learning Angular? As with many frameworks, you should first know the basics of JavaScript, including things like objects, functions, arrays, and all that good stuff. There are some other things that could help you if you learned it beforehand, but I'm not going to say that you have to learn these things before. Some of these I didn't. I learned with Angular, such as TypeScript, which is a superset of JavaScript, and it includes things like static typing. It also includes a lot of ES6-like features. Classes, so Angular uses classes in its components, its services, and so on. High-order array methods like for each, map, filter, these are going to be used in just about every framework and even vanilla JavaScript, as well as arrow functions, promises, and observables. So promises are used for asynchronous data or asynchronous operations, and observables work in a similar way where it's an open data stream. And observables are included with RxJS, which is reactive extensions, and Angular comes with our XJS by default. And when we use a service, and for instance, we make an HTTP request to some API, we usually return that as an observable to the component. Okay, and if that sounds confusing, don't worry about it. We're going to get into all that. The MVC pattern, model view controller, I'm not saying you have to master it or anything, but maybe just, spend a half hour or so reading about it. I do have a video called What is MVC or something. It's called something like that, but I just basically explain the fundamentals. All right, so React and Vue aren't all that much different than vanilla JavaScript. They just simply provide a structure, but Angular does things kind of in its own way. So as I said, it uses TypeScript over JavaScript, which includes static typing. Now, you don't have to use static typing. That's the beauty of it. It's optional. However, I would suggest using it because it can make your application more robust. And you can also use TypeScript with React and Vue. It's just not mandatory. It's actually not mandatory with Angular, but it's much more difficult to not use TypeScript. So Angular uses reusable components as other frameworks do, but it also comes with something called services, which are used to share data and functionality across components. And services are one thing I love about Angular because it solves a lot of the different state issues that other frameworks face. There's also the concept of modules. Angular is comprised of many different modules, such as the root app module, the forms module for reactive forms. It even has its own HTTP module, so instead of using like the Fetch API or having to install Axios or some other library, you get a custom HTTP module to make your GET requests and POST requests and so on. Also, instead of promises, in many cases, you'll be using observables, which are basically open data streams. So when we make an HTTP request from a service, we usually return an observable and then subscribe to that observable in the component, and that's how we handle asynchronous operations. So there is a pretty steep learning curve for Angular, but I will say it's very, very high level. So unlike React and Vue, there's not too many ways to do the same thing, which can make things a bit easier in that aspect. But again, it's such a large framework and there's a lot to it that it makes learning it kind of difficult. All right, so just like with React and Vue, we have reusable UI components. So for instance, a simple to-do app like the one we'll be creating, you want to look at each part of your user interface as a separate component. So we have the to-dos component. Each item is a to-do item, or I'm sorry, a to-do component. We have the add component down here, the search component. So when you're working with any framework, you want to think of your website or application in terms of UI components rather than just separate HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So that brings us to the anatomy of a component. And this is just a very simple component that I could just barely fit on the page. So basically we bring in Angular, or we bring in the component package from Angular core. So Angular has a bunch of these different packages that it includes. And this might look a little weird to you. This is actually a TypeScript decorator, and it includes basically metadata for the component. So the selector is what we're going to use as the HTML tag to insert this component into into the browser, into the UI. We also have a template URL, which is going to be an HTML file where we can actually use something called string interpolation, where we can embed variables and stuff like that. And then we also have a style sheet associated with the component. So just like with React and Vue, you have your functionality, or your JavaScript or TypeScript in our case, and you also have your CSS or your styling, and then you have your template or your HTML. Everything is bundled within that component. So down here we have a class, which is just like any other class. We're exporting it. We're saying implements on init, okay, which we're also bringing in. On init is basically like a lifecycle method. It runs when the component is created. So if you want to do something when that component is created, you want to do it in that method. Okay. You also have a constructor that runs automatically, but the constructor is basically to import any services that you want to use. Okay, and don't worry if this doesn't make sense. We're going to do all this. So we also have properties. As you can see, we have a name and age property, and this right here is TypeScript. So we're saying that this name equals the string Brad, and we're just labeling it as a string. Okay, here we're just saying that this is a number. So this is TypeScript. All right, we can also do this with our functions, with our parameters and our functions and so on as well. All right, so that's a basic component. Now, the CLI is pretty powerful. I mean, we can create a new application with ngNew and then naming it. ngServe will run the dev server. ngBuild will build out our static assets. And then we can generate things like components, services, and modules as well. So we'll be using all these commands. So quick note on state management. With Angular, I find it less necessary to do to use something like Redux or NGRX, which is pretty popular with Angular, because of the way that services work and the way that the framework is structured. However, if you have a very large application where you need application level state that you want to bring down to all your components, then you may want to look into state management with something like NGRX. But we're not going to get into any third-party state management library or anything like that. All right, so that's pretty much the gist of what Angular is and what it includes. So now we're going to jump in and we're going to create a little application, take a look at some of the syntax, the concepts, structure of the framework, and so on. All right, guys, so we're going to get started, and this is going to go kind of quick because we only have a limited amount of time, and I want to cram as much information, concepts, syntax as I can into this video. So this is the Angular website, angular.io. All the documentation is here, so we have a little tutorial. There's the fundamentals, architecture, modules, components, services, a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about. But if you want to go more in depth, then check out the documentation. All right, you're going to have Node.js installed because you need npm, which is the Node Package Manager, and that's what we use to install the Angular CLI, and that's what we use to create an Angular application. So just go to nodejs.org, download either the long-term support or the current version. All right, now this is ultimately what we're going to end up with. It's a simple to-do list, but there's quite a bit that goes into it. Now I want you to look at this as separate components. So basically we have the header component, this top part here. We have the add to-do component, which is this form. We have the to-dos component, which is all of the to-dos together. And then each to-do item is also a separate component. And we're going to be able to mark them as complete and delete them, and of course add one as well. Now these to-dos are actually coming from what's called a fake REST API from JSON Placeholder, which is a fantastic service. And if we go down here, there's different resources that we can make requests to, such as posts, comments, and so on. We're going to be dealing with to-dos, and as you can see, there's an ID, a title, and a completed value. Okay, we're going to ignore the user ID. We don't need that. But ultimately, this is the data that we're going to be fetching, and we're going to be making requests to. You can see you can make a post request, put, patch, delete. So we're going to be dealing with this. But before we get to it, we're just going to store our data locally. Okay, we're just going to store our to-dos just in an object, or an array of objects, I should say. All right, but ultimately this is what we're going to end up with. I just wanted to show you that so you can kind of get an idea in your head what we'll be building, and I'll be explaining the concepts along the way. All right, so let's open up our terminal here, and after you install Node.js, just run npm --version just to make sure that you actually have it installed. All right, then next thing we want to do is install the Angular CLI. So we're going to run npm, actually I'm on a Mac, so I want to do sudo to run it as root, and then npm install -g for global, and then at Angular/CLI. Okay, so that's going to install it globally so that you can generate an Angular application whenever and wherever you want on your machine. Mine should go pretty quick because I already have it installed. Or not. All right, so now that that's installed, we want to generate a new application. So we'll run ng. Well, first of all, you can check to make sure that it got installed with ng --, version. Gives you the version of the CLI, TypeScript, Node, all that good stuff. And then we'll run ng new, and I'm going to call this Angular -crash to-do list. And it's going to ask if we want to use routing. Basically, it will just create the routing module for us. I'm going to say yes. And then you can choose if you want Sass or less or stylus. I'm just going to go with just regular CSS. Okay, so what it's doing now is it's creating a folder called Angular Crash To-Do List, and it's generating all of the core Angular files, including all the stuff for development, for the dev server, all that stuff. And what we'll do is open it in the text editor and start to look at some of the files. All right, so I'm going to clear this out. We want to cd into that folder, so Angular-crash-to-do list. And I'm going to open this with VS Code by just saying code dot. And that's going to open up VS Code, and you can see I have all the files in the sidebar over here, which we'll take a look at in a second. But I do want to run the dev server that Angular CLI provides, and we can do that with ngserve. Okay, and then if we do -- open, that will open it up for us in the browser. So let's go ahead and run that. Might take a couple seconds the first time you run it. And there's basically our boilerplate. All right, so I'm going to close up these other tabs here. And we're going to let that run. And I just want to take a look at a couple files here. We're definitely not going to look at all of them. You don't need to know what all of these files mean right now. But let's look at package.json, which kind of gives us an idea of what's included. It shows us all the dependencies, all the packages that are included. And you can see that there's a ton. If you look at the React or Vue package.json, there's just a couple dependencies. This is just a lot. And you can see that a lot of them are just part of Angular. They're broken up into different packages. You have the animations library, common, which has to do with the necessary services and directives that the framework needs, the compiler for templates, core, which is like the critical parts of Angular, the form module, platform browser, which has to do with loading the core app in the DOM, the router. You have RxJS for observables, and then dev dependencies. You have TypeScript. You have all kinds of testing things like Karma and Jasmine. So there's a lot that Angular includes. And then up here under scripts, you'll see that we have ngserve, which we just ran, which creates the dev server, runs it on 4200. And then ngbuild is what you'll run when you're ready to deploy, when you want to build out your static assets. It'll actually create a folder called dist that you can upload to your server, to your host. And then there's testing, linting, end-to-end testing. So there's a lot that Angular includes by default. So next file I want to look at is in source and then index.html. Now this is the main page that loads in the browser. Angular, Vue, React, they're all single page app frameworks, meaning that it really only loads one single page in the browser, and that's this page here. And this right here, this app root directive, or kind of looks like a custom HTML tag, this is embedding the root app component. Okay, so every Angular application has a root app component, and then all of our components that we create will go inside of that. Okay, I'm just going to change this title right here to to-do list. So if I save this, you can see that the server will auto reload and the title is changed. Now, if you want to include, like, let's say Bootstrap, like a CDN, maybe Font Awesome, you could put it in this file. However, Angular gives you this config file right here, angular.json. And if we go down here, you can see styles and scripts as well as assets, and you can import Bootstrap or anything you want here, as well as local files like this style CSS, which is actually right here. Okay, so that's being loaded automatically, and that's kind of your global style sheet. And there's a ton of other things here that I'm not going to go over. You can change like the name of your output directory and stuff like that. So that's the main index.html. Now, in the app folder, this is where you'll be creating all your components, your services, everything like that. And there's a file called app.module.ts. And this is basically the entry point to Angular, and kind of the meeting place for all your components and everything like that. So right here, we have this ng module. Angular is comprised of different modules, and this is the root app module. And you notice that it takes in a couple things: declarations, imports, providers, and Bootstrap. So declarations is where your components are going to go, including the main app component that's being brought in here. Whenever you create a new component, it has to get added here. And the CLI allows us to generate components, and when you use the CLI, it'll automatically put your components in here, so you don't have to worry about editing this file for components. When you want to use a module, like let's say the HTTP module, you'll have to bring that in here and add it to imports. And as you can see, it's using the browser module, which has to do with the DOM, and then also the routing module. All right, since we said we wanted to use the router, it created this file and included it for us. And then providers has to do with services that you want to include. And then Bootstrap, we're just bootstrapping the main app component, and that's what we're seeing here. All right, and we're bringing that in from right here, as you can see, app.component. That's actually importing the TS file. All of your components are going to have a TypeScript file. It's going to be TS, not JS. So let's take a look at the main app component. And notice there's different files. There's .ts, .spec.ts, which has to do with testing. We're not going to touch that. There's the .html and .css. Okay, the HTML is the template. The CSS is obviously the styling. Now, this TypeScript component here, we're importing the component package from Angular Core, and then this right here might look a little funny to you if you've never used TypeScript. This is called a decorator, and it includes metadata for the component, like the selector. So basically the selector is what will be used in the directive or the HTML element. So if we look at the index.html, this app root right here is coming from that selector. We're just loading that component here using whatever is listed right here. And when we create a component with the generator, with the CLI, it'll add a selector for us. It'll be app-whatever. So we also have template URL, which is just pointing to the HTML template, and then the style URLs, which points to the style sheet. All right, now down here we have our actual class, and the class has one property called title, which is set to this string. Now, if we look at the HTML, which is the template, it has a bunch of just hard-coded HTML, and then it has this right here, this double curly braces with the title. So this is called string interpolations. We can actually put dynamic content in our template with this. And that's what we're seeing here, this Angular crash to-do list. That's coming from the TS file, this right here. And I can actually change this to, let's say, name. And I'll change this to Brad. Save it, and then we'll go to the HTML. I'm just going to get rid of everything here and just put in a div. All your templates need to be wrapped in a single element. Doesn't have to be a div, but I'm going to use a div here. And then just put an H1, and I'll say hello, and I'll put in double curly braces and then name. You don't need these spaces. It's just a convention I like to use. So let's save that and take a look, and we get hello Brad. Okay, so any properties you create here, you can insert like this. And you can also put like JavaScript expressions, like I could do 1 + 1 and save, and you see we get 2. Okay, we can add methods, like let's say 2 uppercase and save, and now Brad is all uppercase. Now Angular also has what are called pipes. So instead of doing this to make it uppercase, we can add a pipe. It's a pipe character, and there's one called uppercase. And if I save that, we take a look, it does the same thing. So if you want to look at more of the pipes, you can look in the documentation. They have pipes for currency, for dates, and stuff like that. There's lowercase, uppercase. It might be worth something to check out. But again, I'm not going to spend too much time on every little thing. All right, so let me just get rid of this. We're going to change this in a second. I just kind of wanted to show you how that works. Now, this here, we're defining a property, but we're not using TypeScript, and it's really recommended to use TypeScript. So what we would do is define this type as a string. Okay, so : string. And the functionality is no different. It's going to do the same thing, but it makes our code a little bit more robust. If I were to make this, let's say, a 12, which is a number, automatically, since I'm using the Angular extension, it gives me this error that 12 is not assignable to type string. Now, if I save this, it's still going to load hello 12. However, if I look in my my server right here, where I have my server running, it gives us the warning and lets us know that this is not right. This should be a string. All right, so I'm going to put that back. Now we can also have methods inside of our component here, and one method we could use is a constructor, which if you've dealt with object-oriented programming before, you know that a constructor basically runs on instantiation, or in our case, when our component is initialized. So if I put like console.log 123 and I save, and then I open up my Chrome tools, you'll see 123. As soon as the component loads, that runs. And I have access to these properties inside of the constructor as well as any other methods that I create. So if I say this.name equals, I don't know, Ted, and save, now we get hello Ted because the constructor ran before this rendered out on the screen. And of course this has to be a string. If I try doing 12 here, you can see that we get an error, and we'll get an error here as well. All right. So if I wanted to create a custom method, like let's say change name, that takes in a parameter of name, and we want to use TypeScript here. This parameter is a string, and it doesn't return anything. I usually leave it like this, but you can do void, which means it doesn't return anything. And then we could do this.name equals whatever's passed in as name. And then if I wanted to in the constructor, I could say this.changeName to call it and pass in John and save, and now we get hello John. All right, so none of this has to do with what we're doing. I just wanted to kind of show you how this works. So let's get rid of that, and let's create a new component. So I'm going to open up my integrated terminal here, and to generate a component, we can do ng generate component, and I want to put all my components in a folder called components. And so I'm going to say components. I don't even have to create it, it'll create it for me. And then we'll do slash, let's say, to-dos. Okay, now if I run that, you'll see it creates a bunch of stuff, the components folder itself, and then a folder called to-dos with all my component files in it that include the TS file, TypeScript file, the HTML, the CSS. And if we check that out, the TS file, it looks pretty much like the main app component, except it has this on init that it's bringing in, that it implements, and then has ng on init here. So this is basically like a lifecycle method. It's similar to in React, like component did mount, or in Vue you have, created on or created. And it works like the constructor in that it runs right away, but you don't really want to use the constructor to do much. You want to use this. The constructor is basically used to import services, and I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. But what I want to do now is check out the to-dos component HTML. When you create a component, by default, it's just going to be a paragraph that says whatever the name of the component and then works. So we'll change this to an H1 and we'll just say to-dos. Now if I save that, we don't see it because we haven't embedded it yet. We just created it. So we can go to our main app component HTML, and let's replace the H1 with app-to-dos. Now the reason I'm using app-to-dos is because if we look at the to-dos component we just created, that's the selector. Okay, so whatever this selector is, that's what you're going to use for your directive. Okay, so let's save that, and now if we look, we get to-dos. I'm actually going to make this smaller so we can see these at the same time, and we'll make this a bit smaller as well. Alright, so we have our to-dos component showing. Now in our to-dos component in the TypeScript file, we need some data, because what I want to do is loop through all of our to-dos and output them. Now, ultimately, these to-dos are going to be, they're going to come from JSON placeholder, and we're going to fetch them through a service, and then we're going to subscribe to a method in that service through our component. But for now, I'm just going to store them right in the component. So let's create a property here called to-dos. Now, for the type, remember we did like string and number and stuff. For the type, it's actually going to be to do, and since this is going to be an array, we're going to put some brackets. Now, it doesn't know what to do is. If we hover over it, it says cannot find name to do. So we have to create it. We're basically going to create a model of what a to do should look like. So in our app folder, not in components, but in the app folder, I'm going to create a models folder. And inside there, I'm going to create a new file called todo.ts, capital T. And this is just going to be just a class with the fields that I want for a to-do. So we're going to say export so that we can bring it into other files, class to-do, and then the fields that we want. So I want an ID, which is going to be a number. Okay, and if you want these to be optional, you can put a question mark like that, but these are going to be required. So we want an ID, we want a title, which is going to be a string, and then we want completed, which is going to be a Boolean. Okay, so that's it. We'll save this, and then we can import it into our to-dos component.ts. So it's going to be from, we want to go ... brings us out of the to-dos folder, again out of the components folder into the models folder and to-do. And now that red line goes away and it knows what a to-do actually is. All right, so as far as adding the array of objects, I'm going to do that in the ng on init. So I'm going to say this .todos because I can access it this way, and I can set it to an array. And let's put our first to do in here. So it's going to have an ID of 1, which should be a number. And you see these red lines, it's because it doesn't match what a to do actually is. It actually says I'm missing the title and completed. So let's add the title. We'll say to do 1, and then completed false, if I can spell it, false. All right, and it pays attention to not only the actual fields, but the types as well. If I make this a number, we get an error here. It tells us that it's supposed to be a Boolean. Okay, so you can see that Angular is a bit more complicated. There's more to it, but it's also very robust. So let's save that. Actually, let's add some more. Let's add 2 more. So I'm just going to copy this down. And let's make this ID 2, 3, 2, 3, and I'll make the middle one completed true. Okay, so we'll save that, and obviously nothing's going to show up yet because we haven't added anything to our template. So let's go to our to-dos component HTML. I'm going to close up the app stuff for now, and what I want to do is loop through this array of to-dos. And we can do that with a directive called ngFor, which is basically kind of like an attribute, like an HTML attribute. And we can put this on any element. For now, I'm going to put it on a UL. So I'll say asterisk ngFor equals, and we can say let to do of to-dos. Okay, and this is going to let me loop through that array of to-dos. So in here, let's put a list item, and let's say to-do.title. Okay, so I'm going to save that, and now you can see we're looping through the to-dos inside of this array right here, and we're outputting them as list items. Now, like I said in the beginning, we want to look at everything as a component, so I don't want to just have list items with the to-dos. I want each to-do to be its own component. So I'm going to go back into my terminal and generate a new component. I'm going to say ng, And we can actually shorten it. Instead of doing generate component, we can do GC. Okay, and I want it to go into the components folder and then call it to do item, like that. Okay, and that's going to do the same thing. It's going to create a to do item folder with all of the TS, the HTML, and the CSS. All right, now for, like I said, I want to output a to do item for each one. So instead of using a UL, I'm actually going to use the to do item component, which if we look at the TS file, the selector is app to do item. So right here, instead of a UL, I'm going to say app dash to do dash item. And same thing right here. Okay, now we don't want to do it. We don't want to do this. We need to pass in each iteration or each to do. And the way that we do that is by adding some brackets and say to do equals to do. So we're basically passing in like a property to this app to do item, which is each one of these. Now, if I save this, we're going to get an error down here that says cannot bind to do since it's not a known property of the to do item component. So let's go to the TS file, the to do item component. And when you pass in something the way that we just did, like this, we actually have to label it as an input. So in the to do item, I'm going to bring in up here from Angular Core something called input. And down here, right in the class, we're going to create an input property. And the way that we do that is by saying at input and say to do, and we're actually going to give it a type of to do, just like we did with just like we did in the to do's component. Okay, and we brought that in right here. So now that we've done that, let's save. Now the error goes away, but we see to do item works 3 times. Now the reason this is happening is because we're passing in these 3 to do's. Okay, we're passing them into the to do item component. However, the to do item component, if we look at the HTML, make this a little bigger. If we look at the HTML, it's just a paragraph that says to do item works. So I could go ahead and change this to do dot title. Let's put some spaces here and save, and now we can see each to do item. All right, now there's a couple things that I want to add to this. Actually, you know what? First thing, before I get to that, I want to add some base CSS, meaning CSS that I want to apply to the whole site, or the whole app. So I'm going to go to the styles.css, and I'm actually going to just paste this stuff in. It's very simple. It's just basically a reset to reset the margin and padding, Arial font, link color, and a button class for the add form or the add to do button. So I'm going to save that. Okay, just change the style up a little bit. And then back in our to do item component HTML, we're going to just add a checkbox, and we will also want a delete button. So, and I'm going to wrap this in a div. So right here, let's put a div, and then let's bring this up. Because you can't do this in your template. You can't have 2 root items like this. Everything has to be wrapped in one. Okay, and then in the paragraph, let's put an input. Actually, I want to do input with the type of checkbox, and we don't need a name and ID. And underneath the to do title, let's put a button, and I'm going to give this button a class of del, and just put an X. Okay, so we'll save that. Now I want some styling that just pertains to this component, so we'll go to our to do item component CSS, and I'm actually going to just paste this in real quick and save. Now the del class is applied to the buttons here, as you can see. However, the to do and the is complete, we haven't used those yet. Now the is complete, I only want this line through if the completed is true. Okay, remember, if we look at if we look at our to-dos, we have completed, which is either true or false. We only want that style to be applied or that class to be applied if that completed is true. So the way that we're going to do this is, let's close that up, is we're going to use something called the ngClasses directive. So I'm going to go to this div here, and I'm going to put brackets and say ngClasses, and we can set this to a method in our class, which I'm going to call setClasses. Okay, so we'll save that. We're going to get an error because there is no setClasses yet. So let's go to our TypeScript file for this component, and inside here we're going to create our setClasses. So I'm going to go down below here. We'll say set dynamic classes. So setClasses, I'm going to create a variable called classes, and the way that this works is we set a class name like to do, and then we set a condition. Now the to do class I always want to get added, so I'm going to just say true. However, the is completed class, and since it has a hyphen I have to put it in quotes or we'll get an error, but the is completed class, I only want this to be in effect if it's completed. So we'll say this dot to do dot completed, and this dot to do pertains to the to do that's being passed in from the input, okay, or from the prop. And then finally we just need to return classes. All right, now I'll save this, and let's see, can't bind ngClasses since it isn't a known property. What did I do wrong here? I said classes. It's not ngClasses, it's ngClass. Okay. So now we have our to-do class, which gives this gray background. We should, however, have a line through this one because it's true, right? Yeah, I set completed to true. Let me just check that out again. So to do and then is completed should be set to this dot to do completed. I'm not really sure why that's not working. Oh, it's is complete, right? Yeah, there we go. Because in the CSS file, the style is complete, not is completed. And now you can see that there's a line through the one that is true. Now if I go back to my data, which right now resides in the to-dos component, and I set the first one to true and save, you'll see that that gets a line through it. All right, so we have dynamic class binding going on. Now, the next thing I want to do is show you about events, and what these events do. It's going to change because ultimately we're going to be dealing with a service, but just to show you how to create an event, let's go to our to-do item component HTML, and let's add an event to this input into this delete button. So I want to change event on the checkbox, and the way that we add an event in Angular is with parentheses, the type of event, which is change, and then we set it to a method. So I'm going to call this on toggle, and I'm going to pass in the to do, which we have access to. Okay, and then for the button, let's set this to click, and when we click, we want to call on delete and pass in the to do. Okay, and then we can go into the TypeScript file and we can create those methods. So we'll say on toggle, oops, actually I don't want to comment, let's say on toggle takes in the to do, and let's console.log, and I'll just say toggle. All right, and then let's go ahead and copy this down, and let's call this one on delete, and we'll console log delete, just to make sure that these work. So if I check a box here down at the bottom here in the console, you see toggle. If I click delete, you see delete. Okay, so it's calling these methods. Now, for the toggle, I can simply take the to-do dot completed and set it to whatever it's not. So if it's true, set it to false. If it's false, set it to true. And I can do that by just saying to-do dot completed. So if I save this and I check this, you'll see that it will toggle the completed state. Now this is only in the UI. Ultimately, I want to change the value on the server. So our JSON placeholder to-dos right here, I want to be able to change these. So that's going to happen using the HTTP module. All right, so I want to move all my data to a service. Instead of having it right in the to-dos component, which is right here in the ng on init, I want to move it to a service. So I'm going to open up my terminal. Oops. I'm going to open up my terminal here. And let's clear this up, and we'll do ng, G for generate, S for service, and I want to go in the services folder and create a to-do service. So I'm just going to say to-do. All right, so we'll go ahead and run that. And as you can see, it's created a services folder, and if we look at to-do service.ts, we import this injectable. What this does is it allows us to inject it into a constructor in a component. All right, and then other than that, it's just a simple class with a constructor. Now, I want to move my data here, so I'm going to, for now, just hard code it in the service before we deal with the HTTP module. So I'm going to say get to-dos, and for now, let's just return an array of to-dos. So I'm going to just move them from the to-dos component, which is right here. So I'll just grab this whole array. Let's grab that, and for now, I'll just get rid of this. And it's going to break for a second, but let's go to our service now and just return that from get to-dos. All right, now in order to get these to-dos, I'm going to go back into my to-dos component and bring in the service. Okay, so up here we'll say import. Let's import to-do service from, I want to go out up 2 levels to services and then to-do service. Now, as I said, the constructor is where you want to actually initialize your services. So you can do private or public. I pretty much always do private, meaning it'll only work here. And then we're going to say to-do service with a lowercase t. And this could be anything you want. I could call it TS or whatever I wanted. And then we're binding it to the to-do service that we just brought in above, which is an uppercase T. Okay, so this right here. Now, we can use this anywhere within this class by just saying this dot to-do service dot any method that's in that service. Okay, and what I want to do is, no pun intended, I want to say this dot to-dos equals this dot to-do service dot, and then there's our get to-dos. It actually has a drop down with it. Okay, so let's save that, and let's see what's going on. To-do service is not a function. Let's see, constructor, get to-dos. Did I save this? Oh, I didn't save this. Okay, so now these are now coming from our service. In fact, if I change this to like the number 1 and save, you can see that these are coming from the service. Okay, now this really isn't the way we do things. Obviously, we don't want to hard code our data here either. We want to fetch it from some kind of back end, some kind of API, and we're going to be using JSON placeholder for that. So what I want to do now is implement the HTTP module, which works similar to Axios or the Fetch API. You just make get request, post request, and so on, get a response, and handle it. So to enable this, we need to go to our app.module.ts. remember the meeting place. And you can see that all the components we've created have been added because we use the CLI. Now I want to bring in the HTTP module. So up here we're going to import HTTP client module, and that's going to come from Angular/common /HTTP. Now, since this is a module, we need to put it in the imports down here. So let's add HTTP client module. Save that, and we can close this up. All right, now in our service, we want to import the HTTP module. So let's go up top here and say import the HTTP client. We also want to bring in HTTP headers for when we send data. We want to make sure we add the content type of JSON. All right, and that's going to be from Angular/common/HTTP. Now, in order to use this, we actually have to inject it into the constructor, just like we did with the service and the component. So we do that by saying private, I'm going to call it HTTP. That way we can just do this.http and set it to the HTTP client. All right, now in get-to-dos, we're going to just completely get rid of this return, and we're going to make a GET request to the JSON placeholder. Now, I'm going to add the URL as a property to this service, to this class. So up here, I'm going to say to-dos URL, and we're going to set this to the JSON placeholder URL, which is this right here. Okay, JSON placeholder typecode.com/todos. That's the root URL here. So to make this request, we can say this.http.get, since it's a GET request, just like it's very similar to Axios. When you use Axios, you do axios.get, .post, .delete, things like that. Okay, so and then after this is going to be in to-do format, so, or the to-do type, and it's going to be an array, so we can actually add that here, but we do need to bring that in from our model. So let's say import to do from models. Actually, where are we? Services. I think we only need to go out once. Yeah, models/to-do. All right, now this get-to-dos is actually going to return an observable. So we're going to add the type of observable, and then it's going to be a to-do observable. So we can actually put in some angle brackets here and say to-do brackets. All right, now this get request is going to take in the to-dos URL, and let's see, can't find name observable. Oh, I didn't bring in observable. We have to bring it in from RxJS. So RxJS it's short for reactive extensions, and that's what includes the observable and all that stuff. So let's say import observable from RxJS. Okay, and let's see. A function was declared with neither to void. You must return a. Oh, I didn't return it. So we're returning this get request, and this should actually be this.todos URL, because since we made this a property up here, we access it with this. Okay. So what this does here is it returns an observable, and we can't just simply, let me just save it so I can show you. We can't just simply say this to-dos equals to-do service.getTodos. We can't do that anymore because this is asynchronous. Think of it as a promise if you're familiar with JavaScript promises. So we're going to get rid of that, and the way that it works is we call .subscribe. Okay, we subscribe to the observable. The observable is basically an asynchronous data stream. Think of subscribe.subscribe as .then. Okay, it's pretty much, it works in syntax, it works the same way pretty much. So it'll give us back to-dos, and we can do what we want with them. In this case, I'm going to set this dot to-dos, which is this right here, which is what we're displaying in our template. I'm going to set that to the to-dos that are returned. All right, so we'll save that. All right, so we're getting an error here. Cannot read property to lowercase. So this means that it's not getting the to-dos. So it's trying to loop through to-dos that aren't there. So I messed something up in the service. So we're getting to-dos, make a get request to the URL, which is this. I set this to colon. This should actually be colon string equals the value. We were setting the URL as the type. So let's save that. There we go. Now we're getting like 200 of these things, and I want to limit it. And we can limit it by putting a question mark underscore limit equals 5. We can do that. Okay, but I don't want the to-dos URL to include this. So what I'll do is just copy this. So I'll cut that off, and then let's make it a whole new property. So we'll say to-dos limit equals, and we'll put that on because we're not always going to use this, especially if we're making like a post request or something. So I'm going to change this down here. I'm just going to wrap this in backticks, and then just put the template literal syntax like that, and then let's just also add this dot to-dos limit, and then save, and there we go. So now it's just adding that. It's adding this on the end of this. So now that we're getting these to-dos, the next thing I want to do is on the toggle, not only do I want to be able to just cross them out like this, I want it to actually send a request, a put request to the server, and update that completed value on the server. All right, now it's not going to stick because JSON placeholder obviously doesn't allow just anybody to edit their actual data, but it does mimic the response request. So let's go back to, let's see, it's in the item. So the to-do item where we have this on toggle. And I'm going to bring in the service into this component. So up here, let's say import to-do service from services / to-do service, and we have to inject it here. Okay, and then down on the on toggle, I still want to keep the obviously the UI stuff that we have here where we put the line through it, but I also want to update the server. So right under this, what I'll do, let's put a comment here and say toggle in UI, and then let's do toggle on server. So we'll say this dot to do service, and we'll create a method there called toggle completed, and we're going to pass in the to do. Okay. Now this is going to return an observable as well, so we want to do dot subscribe, and then that'll give us that to do back, and I'm just going to console log it just so you can see that it's actually getting updated. Okay, so let's save that, and then we'll go back to our service, and let's just put a comment here. Let's get to-dos, and let's say toggle completed. So for toggle completed, we're actually going to make a put request, because a put request is for when you're actually updating something on the server. So let's say toggle completed, which takes in to do, which has a type of to do, and it's going to return an observable. And we're actually going to put any here. because it's not going to be formatted as an exact to-do since it has the user ID. And then in here we're going to return this.http, and we're going to make a put request to a URL, and I'm going to construct that in a minute. We're going to pass in the to-do, and then we also want to pass in the HTTP options, which I didn't create yet, did I? Now, the HTTP options is going to include the header of content type. Since we're sending data, we have to send the content type of application JSON. So up above the injectable, let's say const HTTP options, and set that to an object with headers. And we want to set new HTTP headers. We brought that in above. And that just takes in an object with whatever headers we want to send. In this case, content type. And the type is going to be application/JSON. Okay, we're just passing that in here. Now the URL I'm going to construct because it needs the ID since we're updating a specific to-do. So we're going to set this to the initial to-do's URL. I'm going to put some backticks in here and put this syntax so we can say this dot to-do's URL, and then slash, and then we want the ID, which we can get from the to-do that's passed in .id. All right, so that should make the put request, and I think that should do it. So let's save, and now if I check this off, not only does the line go through it, but you can see the response we get from the server of the completed true. If I click it again, we get a response completed false. So we're actually toggling that value and getting the response back. Okay. So next thing I want to handle is the delete. So the delete button is in the to-do item, as you can see right here. Click, we're calling this on delete, and that is right here, which right now is just console logging. Now to delete, it's a little more difficult because we need to access the to-dos in the UI, which are in the to-dos component above it. Okay, the to-dos component is where we're embedding the to-do item. So we basically have to emit upwards. So let's see, where are we? To-do item TS, and this is kind of hard to explain. Basically, like I said, we need to emit an event upwards. So we're going to bring in up here from the core event emitter as well as output. And once we call this event here, this on delete, we want to emit up. So I'm going to get rid of this and say this dot, I'm going to say delete to do dot emit, and we want to pass along the to do, which is coming in right here. Now up above here, right under where we did the input, we're doing the output. Okay, the input was for when we were actually taking in something, but now we're emitting something out to the parent component. So we're saying output, and the name of the method I'm calling delete to do, and we want to set that to event emitter, and the type is to do, and we're just going to say that this is going to equal a new event emitter. And this is all in the documentation if you want to check it out further. Okay, so this delete to do we actually have to catch. So let's save this and let's go into the parent component, which is the to-dos component, and we're going to go into the HTML. And we're going to catch this. Wait, this is not it. Where is it? To-dos HTML right here. We're going to catch this here. So I'm going to just clean this up a little bit by putting these on separate lines. Okay, and then let's see, we're going to add parentheses here, and we're going to say delete to do and set it to a method that we want to call within the to-dos component, which I'm also going to call delete to do. And we have to pass in this $event. All right, now in the to-dos component, I'm going to create delete to do, which takes in to do, and we'll give it its type and then let's just console log just to see if it actually is going to work. We'll just say delete me. All right, now if I go and I click one of these, we can see delete me. So what's happening is we're clicking the delete button, which sends off an event in the to-do item component. However, we're emitting up delete to do. Okay, we're setting it as output, we're emitting it up, and we're catching it here and setting it to delete to do in the to-dos component, and we're logging it here. Now, ultimately, we want to do two things here. We want to delete it from the UI, and then we also want to make our delete requests, which is going to be in the service. Okay, so let's first do the UI, and that's pretty easy. All we really have to do is, well, we can do this a lot of different ways. I'm going to use filter. So I'm going to say this dot to-dos equals, and take the to-dos and filter, which is kind of like for each and map. It'll loop through all the to-dos, but we can set a condition. I'm going to say for each to-do, I'll call it T, set an arrow function and say where the T ID is not equal to the to-do.id. I want to return, basically I want to return all the to-dos that don't have that ID, because ultimately I want to delete that one. So let's save, and now if I delete, you can see they go from the UI. However, nothing's happening on the server. So underneath that, I'm going to say this dot to do service dot delete to do, which I haven't created yet, and it's going to give us a observable. So I'm going to just subscribe, and I'm not going to do anything afterwards because it's just deleting it. It's not returning anything. And I could put this inside the subscribe. That may be a good idea, but I don't know. I think that doing it this way, it's quicker because it's going to delete it from the UI first rather than waiting. But I mean, you can do it either way, really. But let's save this and let's create this delete to do in the service. Okay, so let's take in a to do, and we'll say observable do. All right, so let's see, we're going to want to make a delete request, and we're also going to need the ID. Okay, just like we did with the put request with this down here. So let's actually grab this same URL like that, and then let's return this dot delete, and let's put in to do and the URL and the HTTP options. Whoops, I forgot HTTP. Okay, so now let's save, and now when I click, it's going to delete it from there as well as the server. All right, so I'll actually put a comment right here. Okay, so the next thing I want to do before I add the add form here, I want to just add a simple header, which is going to be just like a dumb component. It's not really going to have any functionality, but regardless, it is going to be a component. So let's open up our terminal here, and let's do ng generate component in component slash, and I'm going to put it in a folder called layout, and then header. Okay, and let's see, let's go into components, layout, header, and let's open up the HTML file. And I'm just going to put in a header tag. Actually, let's give it a class of header. And I'm just going to put in h1, say to-do list, save that, and I'm going to go into the CSS and just add a little bit of CSS here just for padding and background and stuff. All right, so we'll close those files up, and let's bring that header into the main app component, into the HTML. So right here, I'll just go ahead and say app-header. That's the selector. And save, and there we go, we have a header. All right, next thing is going to be the add to-dos. So I'm actually going to close all of these for now. And let's clear this up and do ng generate component components / add to do. Okay, and let's go into the TS file. Whoops, that's the spec file. And let's see, we're basically going to have one input called title. Now, when you have form inputs, you want to assign those as properties to your component. So right here, I'm going to say title, which is going to be a string. All right, and then I'm going to open the HTML file, and we're going to create our form. So let's get rid of this, and let's say form. I'll give it a class of form. No action. And in here, let's put an input. Let's do type text and give it a name of title. Now, what I want to do is I want to bind this title input. I'm sorry, this title input to the title property that I created. This right here. To do that, we use what's called ngModel. Okay, it's a directive called ngModel, which uses brackets and parentheses because it's basically two-way data binding. So ngModel is going to equal title, and the name attribute should be the same as ngModel. Okay, and let's add a placeholder as well. So we'll just say add to do. All right, and then under that, I'm going to put an input with the type of submit, and give it a value of submit, and give it a class of btn. All right, now as soon as I save that, we get an error because in order to use this ngModel, we have to use the forms module. So we need to head to app.module.ts. Let's go up to where we brought in our other modules, and let's say import forms module, and that's going to be from at angular/forms, and then we just need to add it to our import, the rest of our modules. Okay, we'll save that, and now our app should come back. Now let's actually bring our add to do component in. Now instead of embedding it right in the app component, I'm actually going to embed it in the to-dos component. So in our to-dos HTML, right here, I'm going to go right above where we're looping through the items, and I'm going to do app-add-to-do and save. Okay, and it's going to put it here. Now we need to style this a little bit, so let's go back to our add to do. Let's actually go to the CSS, which is right here, and I'm just going to paste this in. It's just basically making the text input flex 10, so it stretches across. Submit flex 2, and there we go. All right, now since I added ngModel equals title, and we have a title property, I just want to show you something real quick. I'm gonna get rid of it after, but if I put title like that, because remember title is a property and it's also bound to this input. If I save this and I start to type, look at that. Whatever I type in this input is going to directly output right here in this property, which is pretty cool, and you can do some really cool stuff with this. Now I'm not going to keep this here. I just wanted to show you that. So let's get rid of that. Now, ultimately, what we want to happen is when we submit, we want the to-do to get added to the UI. We also want to make a post request to the server. So let's add an event here. Now, there's actually an event called ngSubmit, which we're going to use over just submit, because it handles that. With vanilla JavaScript, when you submit a form, you have to do that e.prevent default and all that. This does it for us, so we don't have to worry about it. So ngSubmit equals, let's say, on submit. All right, we'll save that. We'll go back to the TypeScript for the add to do, and let's create our onSubmit. And then we're going to construct the to do. So let's say to do. Now we don't put an ID because with JSON placeholder, as with most backends, with most APIs, it creates the ID for you. So we just need a title, and we can get it from this .title. Okay, because this input is bound to this property, and remember we can access properties with this. All right, and then completed is just going to be false by default. Now, again, just like with the delete, we have to emit this upwards because we need access to the direct to-dos in the to-do component. So let's go up here and let's bring in event emitter and output. And right here, we're going to this dot add to do dot emit and pass in this to do this right here. All right, and in order to do that, we have to declare our output. So same thing as that we did with the delete. We're going to set this to event emitter, and I don't know why I keep doing that. I keep forgetting to hold shift. So any equals new. I'm doing any because it doesn't have an ID. It's not formatted as our model. So let's say new event emitter. Okay, so we'll save that. What's going on here? Accepts too few arguments. What did I do? Output. I forgot the parentheses. All right, now we have to catch this just like we did before. So we're going to go to our to-dos component HTML, and just like we did the delete right here, we're going to go on the add component, and we're going to do add to do like that. All right, so now we're setting this to run a method in our add to do component called, in our to-dos component called add to do. So let's go to our TS file, not that one. There's actually a command to not generate the spec files, but it's too late now. So we're going to go right under the delete and do add to do. And we're going to first make a request, a post request to the server through the service. And then once we get that observable back, the response back, we're going to add it to our UI here. So let's say this, let's close this up. This dot to do service dot add to do, which I haven't created yet. And then we're going to subscribe to that observable, to that stream or that response. We'll get back a to do. And then once we get that back, we're going to push it. We'll say this dot to do's dot push and push it onto our array. Okay, so let's save that. Let's go to our service, which is lots of files here. So now let's do add to do. Observable. All right, so let's see. For the add, we're going to make a post request. So let's say return this.http.post. We can pass in the URL directly, to do's URL. Pass in our data, which is the to do, and then HTTP options. Okay, oh, I forgot right here. We have to put in our brackets and to do. All right, so let's save that. Let's try it out. So I'll say test, and let's submit. Okay, so what did I mess up? It looks like I messed up something in the add to do TypeScript right here. So title. Okay, so we emit, and let's see. Let's go to our to-dos component. Start service. Oh, I didn't pass in the parameter here, the to-do. All right, so let's try that again. Test, submit, and there we go. So it gets added. All right, cool, and we can delete it as well. All right, so I think the last thing to do here is deal with the router, show you guys how to use the router, which is very simple because at the beginning it asked us if we wanted to use it, and it created this app routing module.ts file. And basically this is all set up for us to just simply add our routes into here. So anything we want to add as a route we need to bring in. So I'm going to bring in the to-dos component. So to-dos component from dot slash component slash to-dos, and let's go right in here and let's put in some curly braces with the path. Now I want this to be the root, so I'm just going to leave this blank, and then the component is going to be the to-dos component. All right, so I'll save that. Now, in order for the router to work, we have to go to our main app component HTML, and instead of just embedding the to-dos, we're going to change this to router dash outlet like that and save, and we should get the same thing. Now, I also want an about page or an about component. So let's open up our terminal and let's say ng generate component slash, I'm going to put it in a folder called pages and then about. Okay, and then let's go into components, pages, about, HTML, and I'm just going to paste in this a little bit of HTML here. Okay, and we'll save that. And we don't have to do anything to the TypeScript. It's basically a dumb component, just a static page. All right. However, I want to add it to the routes, so I'm going to go back to our routing module here, and actually let's bring it in. Oops. Slash pages slash about component, and then I'm going to add another path, except this is going to be about component and the path is going to be about. So I'll save that, and now if I go over here and I go to slash about, there it is. Okay, and then I just want to add a little navigation in the header here. So let's close all this up because this should be all set, and go to the layout header, go to the HTML, and right under the H1 here, I'm just going to add in nav and then a link. Now, when we use the router, we don't use href, we use router link, and we'll go just to slash. So this will be home, and then we'll put a pipe here. We'll do another router link, and this will go to slash about, and we'll say about and save. All right, so now we can go back and forth. All right, cool. So we can add, we can delete, we can mark them off as complete, and that's it. All right, so I mean, there's other things that have to do with Angular that I didn't mention, but like I said, this is a crash course. We're not going to be able to cover every single thing, but hopefully this gives you an idea of how things work. Now, if we wanted to build this out, we could do ng build, and if you watch up here, once it's done compiling, it'll create a dist folder. Okay, so now we have this dist, and this is what we would actually deploy to a web host. Okay, so that's it, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed this little crash course, and if you did, please leave a like. I'd appreciate that, and I'll see you next time.